Dear viewers, this is part 2 of the two-part series on food balance in Prescribon Medical Education series. Now, coming back to discussion on food balance, the average daily requirement for protein is 30 to 50 grams. 20 to 30 grams of the body proteins are degraded daily and used to produce other body chemicals. Therefore, all cells must continue to form new proteins to take the place of those that are being destroyed. And a supply of protein is necessary in the diet for this purpose. An average person can maintain normal stores of protein if the daily intake is between 30 to 50 grams. Protein requirement at different ages. Babies need 10 grams. School age kids need 25 grams. Teenage boys about 50 grams. Teenage girls 45 grams. Adult men 30 to 50 grams a day. Adult women need about 40 grams a day and 70 grams if pregnant or breastfeeding. In general, proteins derived from animal foodstuffs are more complete. Complete means they have all essential amino acids than are proteins derived from vegetable and grain sources. Proteins of corn or other cereals like rice or wheat and legumes, that is different pulses, complement each other and together provide all of the essential amino acids in the diet. Dear listeners, by the way, this educational video is made possible by Prescribon, the makers of e-prescription software for digital prescriptions, available freely for doctors on the website www.prescribon.com. Doctors who are interested in this e-prescription can freely avail of its vast collection of more than 100,000 e-prescriptions. Carbohydrates and fats act as protein sparers. When a person's diet contains an abundance of carbohydrates and fats, almost all the body's energy is derived from these two substrates and little is derived from proteins. Therefore, carbohydrates and fats are said to be protein sparers. Regulation of food intake and energy storage. Stability of the body's total mass and composition over long periods requires that energy intake match energy expenditure. Only about 27% of the energy ingested normally reaches the functional systems of the cells. Much of this energy is eventually converted to heat, which is generated as a result of protein metabolism, muscle activity, and activities of the various organs and tissues of the body. Excess energy intake is stored mainly as fat. Deficits of energy stores, for example, rapidly activate multiple mechanisms that cause hunger and drive a person to seek food. In athletes and laborers, energy expenditure for the high level of muscle activity may be as high as 10,000 calories per day, compared with only about 2,000 calories per day for sedentary individuals. What are the physiological mechanisms that sense changes in energy balance and influence the quest for food? Neural centers regulate food intake. The sensation of hunger is associated with a craving for food and several other physiological effects, such as rhythmic contractions of the stomach and restlessness, which cause the person to seek food. A person's appetite is a desire for food. If the quest for food is successful, the feeling of satiety occurs. The hypothalamus contains hunger and satiety centers. Several neuronal centers of the hypothalamus participate in the control of food intake. Much chemical crosstalk occurs among the neurons in the hypothalamus and together These centers coordinate the processes that control eating behavior and the perception of satiety. The hypothalamic feeding and satiety centers have a high density of receptors for neurotransmitters and hormones that influence feeding behavior. Neural centers that influence the mechanical process of feeding. Another aspect of feeding is the mechanical act of the feeding process. The actual mechanics of feeding are controlled by centers in the brainstem. Factors that regulate quantity of food intake. Regulation of the quantity of food intake can be divided into short-term regulation, which is concerned primarily with preventing overeating at each meal, and long-term regulation, which is concerned primarily with maintenance of normal quantities of energy stores in the body. Short-term regulation of food intake. When a person is driven by hunger to eat voraciously and rapidly, what turns off the desire to eat when he or she has eaten enough? There has not been enough time for changes in the body's energy stores to occur, and it takes hours for enough nutritional factors to be absorbed into the blood to cause the necessary inhibition of eating. Yes, it is important that the person not overeat and that he or she eat an amount of food that approximates nutritional needs. Several types of rapid feedback signals are important for these purposes. Gastrointestinal filling inhibits feeding. When the stomach and the duodenum get filled up, stretch inhibitory signals are transmitted by way of the vagal nerve to suppress the feeding centers, thereby reducing the desire for food and providing a negative feedback mechanism to help limit meal size. Gastrointestinal hormonal factors suppress feeding. Cholecystokinin (CCK), released in response to fat and proteins entering the duodenum, enters the blood and acts as a hormone to influence several gastrointestinal functions such as gallbladder contraction, gastric emptying, gut motility, and gastric acid secretion. However, CCK also activates receptors on local sensory nerves in the duodenum, sending messages to the brain via the vagus nerve that contribute to satiation and meal cessation. The effect of CCK is short-lived. CCK functions mainly to prevent overeating during meals. Note: cholecystokinin (CCK) is a hormone produced in the small intestine. When fats and proteins enter the small intestine, cholecystokinin triggers the gallbladder and pancreas to contract. Oral receptors meter food intake. Various oral factors related to feeding, such as chewing, salivation, swallowing, and tasting, have been postulated to meter the food as it passes through the mouth. After a certain amount has passed, the hypothalamic feeding center becomes inhibited. The inhibition caused by this metering mechanism, however, is considerably less intense and of shorter duration, usually lasting for only 20 to 40 minutes, than is the inhibition caused by gastrointestinal filling. Intermediate and long-term regulation of food intake. Temperature regulation and food intake. When one is exposed to cold, increased feeding occurs. When exposed to heat, there is a tendency to decrease caloric intake. This phenomenon is caused by interaction within the hypothalamus between the temperature regulating system and the food intake regulating system. This is important because increased food intake in a cold animal or a human being increases its metabolic rate, and two, it provides increased fat for insulation, both of which tend to protect against the cold. Feedback signals from adipose tissue regulate food intake. Most of the stored energy in the body consists of fat, the amount of which can vary considerably in different persons. What regulates this energy reserve and why is there so much variability among individuals? In this diagram, energy balance regulation is shown. Hypothalamus is the central processing unit where impulses from various areas of the body such as fat tissue, stomach, pancreas and intestine reach. They are processed in the hypothalamus and necessary stimulatory signals for eating or expending energy as exercise are sent to relevant areas of the body. Hypothalamic circuits regulating energy homeostasis. See figure shown earlier, that is energy balance regulatory circuitry. Hypothalamus senses energy storage through the actions of leptin, a peptide hormone released from adipocytes. When the amount of adipose tissue increases, signaling excess energy storage, the adipocyte produce increased amounts of leptin, which is released into the blood. Leptin then circulates to the brain and occupies leptin receptors in the hypothalamus, as well as neurons in other areas of the brain, including the brainstem. Stimulation of leptin receptors in these central nervous system nuclei initiates multiple actions that decrease fat storage. Thus, leptin is an important means by which the adipose tissue signals the brain that enough energy has been stored and that intake of food is no longer necessary. Obesity may be associated with leptin resistance, that is, leptin receptors in the hypothalamus and other areas of the brain may be resistant to activation by leptin in obese people who continue to overeat despite having very high levels of leptin. See also discussion on overweight in Prescribon medical education series. Energy homeostasis is tightly regulated, with the hypothalamus playing a pivotal role in integrating signals from adipose tissue stores such as leptin and short-term meal-related signals from the gut like peptide YY, that is PYY, glucagon-like peptide 1, that is GLP-1, cholecystokinin referred to earlier, and ghrelin. Note: cholecystokinin stimulates the gallbladder to contract and release stored bile into the intestine. It also stimulates the secretion of pancreatic juice and may induce satiety. L cells that secrete PYY are located along much of the length of the GI epithelium, that is jejunum, small intestine and large intestines. L cells secrete the anoxygenic, lowering appetite peptide YY, that is PYY. It modulates eating. Their receptors are expressed in the brainstem and hypothalamus. The hypothalamus integrates these sensory inputs, compares those inputs to set points for energy homeostasis, and then initiates a set of responses by activating autonomic, endocrine, and behavioral outputs that aim to maintain these set points, that is homeostasis. Summary of long-term regulation. Even though our information on the different feedback factors in long-term feeding regulation is imprecise, the following general statement can be made. When the energy stores of the body fall below normal, the feeding centers of the hypothalamus and other areas of the brain become highly active and the person exhibits increased hunger as well as the behavior of searching for food. Conversely, when the energy stores, mainly the fat stores, are already abundant, the person usually loses the sensation of hunger and develops a state of satiety. Importance of having both long and short-term regulatory systems for feeding. The long-term regulatory system for feeding, which includes all the nutritional energy feedback mechanisms, helps maintain constant stores of nutrients in the tissues, preventing them from becoming too low or too high. The short-term regulatory stimuli serve two other purposes. First, they tend to make the person eat smaller quantities at each eating session, thus allowing food to pass through the gastrointestinal tract at a steadier pace so that its digestive and absorptive mechanisms can work at optimal rates rather than becoming periodically overburdened. Second, they help prevent the person from eating amounts at each meal that would be too much for the metabolic storage systems once all the food has been absorbed. So, dear viewers, this is the end of part 2 in the two-part series on food balance in the Prescribon medical education series. Thank you for watching the video.